Welcome, class. This is our historical survey. We want to sketch out some important features of this. We don't want to learn all the history from the Persian period to the time of Christ, but the major players we need to know, the major empires that preceded the time of Christ. We begin with the Assyrian Empire, and that's important because the Assyrians sent the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes of Israel, into captivity in 722 BC. Next is the Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian period, as it's called. The major players then were Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus the Great. It was Nebuchadnezzar who defeated the Assyrians in the Battle of Salat. His son, Nebuchadnezzar, brought about the end of the Hebrew kingdom of Judah and the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. He departed the population to Babylonia in the event referred to as the exile. Very critical to know that. He then proceeded to carry off Israelites into captivity 3 different times in 605, 597, and 586. We'll look at a little more details later. The Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar's time appeared frequently at the end of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, and also the early part of Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. They record the subsequent return of the remnant from Judah from their Babylonian exile. Another key important event, the return from exile. Among the prophetic books, Isaiah speaks of Babylon during the period of Assyrian dominance. A century later, Jeremiah warns of the threat of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. Ezra, Ezekiel, and Daniel then speak of Babylon from a latter point of view from those who are in exile. There are many references to Babylon in the last half of Jeremiah, for example. In fact, so many references, it's more than all the rest of the Bible. So what is Babylon? Babylon is a symbol of the enemy of God's people in the Bible. Look at 1 Peter 5 and Revelation 14, 16, 18. So 586, the last deportation and the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. The Persian period is where we really begin our emphasis. The period from Cyrus the Great to Alexander the Great. In 538, Cyrus makes a decree that allows captives to return home. Cyrus issues a decree permitting the reconstruction of the house of God at Jerusalem in 2 Chronicles 36 and also in Ezra 1. Isaiah's prophecy spoke of Cyrus as the Lord's anointed, Isaiah 45:1. Isaiah regarded him as called and empowered by God to free them. That prophecy was fulfilled 150 years later. Haggai and Zechariah encouraged the Jews and urged the completion of the temple. So 4 years later, it was completed in 516 BC. This begins what's referred to as the Second Temple period. It's the temple of Jesus' day. It's important you to know that the Second Temple period, referred in all scholarly literature, begins here in 516. And it was Herod the Great who renovated that temple, and that was the temple that was destroyed in 70 AD. That period is called the Second Temple period. Chaldean prince Nebuchadnezzar established the 10th dynasty of Babylon. It's also called the Chaldean dynasty or the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. You'll see both terms used to describe the kingdom in literature. With the ascension, the 10th dynasty of Babylonian independence movement gained its long-sought goal, that is freedom from Assyrian domination. And you can see the extent on the map. It includes Israel, of course, and Egypt. The return from exile, the post-exilic or Persian period, has a lot of Aramaic documents. Parts of the Old Testament is not written just in Hebrew, but in Aramaic. These are the official documents that appear in the post-exilic or Persian period. So a letter of complaint was written to Artaxerxes about the rebuilding of the city walls in Ezra chapter 4. There's also a letter of Darius first and the king's reply in chapter 5. In Artaxerxes, he permitted Ezra to return, and also included a description of materials entrusted into his keeping in Ezra chapter 7. All those sections were official correspondence, and as such, it was naturally recorded in Aramaic. So Aramaic documents, Aramaic was the diplomatic language of the Persian period. The continuance of a large Jewish community in Babylon shows that not all Jews responded to the invitation to return to their homeland, probably because of the prosperity they had acquired. So there's three different returns here that you see on this chart. With a great enthusiasm, the Jews returned, some Jews, that is, Ezra 2 says there's 42,360 of them. They challenged that 4-month-long, 900-mile journey back to Israel. And they rebuilt the altar of sacrifice and resumed the observance of traditional feasts. Soon after, the work on the Second Temple commenced, the materials and the master craftsmen being imported from Tyre and Sidon. And you can read all about that in Ezra 3 and 1 Kings 5. There was some opposition from neighbors, and that also led to a delay, why it took 4 years. And there's also selfishness in among the Jews that they looked to building their own homes. I gave that a higher priority than the Lord's house. There's a series of crop failures. All that's in Haggai chapter 1 and in chapter 2. And Haggai and Zechariah appear around 520 BC. They encouraged Zerubbabel and Joshua, the high priest, to rebuild. They actually rebuked the people for their apathy and selfishness, and they promised God's presence and blessing upon the temple project. Zechariah's preaching went beyond the building of the temple to the rebuilding of Jerusalem itself. Two world leaders here, Zerubbabel and Joshua, important names. Zerubbabel also appears in the genealogy of Jesus Christ in both Matthew 1 and Luke 3. The two leaders were addressed in ways which anticipated the Messiah. You can see that in Haggai chapter 2, 21 to 23, and Zechariah 6, verses 10 through 14. So in February 516, 515, depending on the day how you date it, but it's dedicated. The temple's dedicated. The Jewish community began to have a focal point for its religion, and that along with political insecurity in a still shattered city. Now, Ezra's appeal for Levitical enforcements in Ezra 8 suggests that the Jewish community in Babylonia was extremely well organized. And this leads us to the book of Esther. So during the Persian period, we have the book of Esther. The Persian period, during the reign of Ahasuerus, also Xerxes I. Let me go to that next chart that shows these kings, and we'll talk about all of them a little bit. But notice that Xerxes I, there was the deliverance of the Jews from their oppressors, recorded in Esther, and it was celebrated subsequently as the Feast of Purim. And this is something that was current in Jesus' day, this Feast of Purim. So let's look at some of these kings. Cyrus the Great, of course, allows the Jews to return from exile. Then there's Darius the Great. Note the dates. It was during his reign the temple was completed. He was known as a great builder. By the way, there's some innovations and ideas and new engineering techniques that he invents for building road systems. And all the engineering done by Greeks and the Romans later were started by the Persians. He also started an official government-sponsored coinage in Palestine and allowed the Jews to mint their own coins to use as temple tax. The temple tax is mentioned in the New Testament. Then we have Xerxes I. Of course, this is the Feast of Purim during this period, the book of Esther and so forth. Artaxerxes I, why is he important? Well, he reigned when Ezra returns to Jerusalem in 458. He implemented a religious reform. You can read about that in Ezra 7. Then in 445, the return of Nehemiah, who rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. Then we go down to Xerxes II. Notice dates coincide with Malachi and Ezra's third return to Jerusalem. Then you have Xerxes III. It coincides with a small deportation of Jews, a reversal of policy of Cyrus, who allowed the groups to return to their own land. Well, why did that happen? Well, because there was a Phoenician revolt against Persia in 351, and it's debated as how much Judah was actually involved in that revolt, but as a precaution, there were some Jews returned back to Persia. Then it's Darius the third lost the empire. His armies were defeated by Alexander the Great in 333 BC. And so that really gets us into some of the lessons learned during the Persian period. What were these lessons learned? This gives us a framework for understanding the New Testament, by the way. Note these developments. Yahweh was indeed the sovereign Lord. They learned that during this time. Why? Because he was able to bring them back from captivity, from obscurity. The dry bones became alive again. Their exile was the fulfillment of prophecy. Remember that Isaiah prophesied 150 years prior. God allowed them to go into exile and under Assyria and under Babylon to learn about him, that he was holy. He demanded obedience. So Ezekiel viewed the national calamity as God's righteous judgment. They had forsaken the covenant and were given grave danger of vanishing all the distinguishable characteristics of them as a people of God. Their survival is largely due to the fact that they rediscovered their identity as the covenant community, which marked them off from other nations and called for a measure of separation. The symbols of covenant, Sabbath observance, and circumcision, the need for ritual cleanliness, gave outward expression to God's holiness. And they relearned that. And they saw the lesson of the exile. They also learned that God would vindicate the righteous. You have the story of Esther. His people, as they maintained covenant faithfulness to him, God would be faithful to vindicate. They also learned that God had not forsaken his covenant people. Despite all appearances, they needed to see the fingerprints of God on the pages of history. And also they learned the hope of Israel embodied in the promise of the Messiah. It's during this period they began to long for Israel's restoration as a great nation. It's the prophets who said that that would happen when the Messiah comes. So the messianic hope begins to build during this period. We see it continue to build during the next period that we'll look in the next lecture. God is faithful also, they learn, to return and restore to the land, to rebuild the temple. And it's important for faith to remain vibrant and alive. It was the land, it was the people in the temple that to experience God working on their behalf. In fact, they did experience a restoration during this period. So the Persian period laid the groundwork for Hellenization. Hellenization becomes the greatest challenge to Jewish identity during the next period of time. Persian Empire was important for this development. God was orchestrating events that worked to the development of the next empire's influence for Israel's return, the coming of Messiah. Persian Empire, important for civilization. The Greeks and Romans copied much of what Persians developed, such as roads for the movement of officials, and that became important for the missionary journeys. The armies and the letters of administrations and Cyrus's and Darius's decrees, all of that was that laws, the rule of law instead of the arbitrary whims of local and regional rulers. This was copied by Rome, and this allowed for the Pax Romana, the peace during the time when Christ was on earth, for the development of the church throughout the empire. Also, to maintain unity of the empire that stretched thousands of miles, you need cultural exchange from various ethnic and regional groups. This in turn led to a world awareness, a consciousness that there's other perspectives and views on how to live and what worked. This mindset then led to an openness to the gospel. So we're going to get more into the major empires under the Persians. We have the intertestamental period, the 400 years of silence because of gap in the biblical record. And during this gap, Alexander the Great came from Greece, Macedonia, and conquered the Middle East by inflicting defeats on the Persians at different battles. Then Alexander died in 323 BC at the age of 33 and divided his empire into 4 parts. 2 of these parts are important for New Testament historical background: the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt, Alexandria was the capital. So Cleopatra died in 30 BC, was the last Ptolemaic dynasty. Important development during this time was that Palestine was sandwiched between Egypt and Syria. It became a victim of rivalry between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, both of whom wanted to collect taxes from Israel. At first, the Ptolemies dominated Palestine for 122 years. Generally, the Jews fared well during this time. It was under Ptolemy Philadelphus who commissioned Jewish scholars to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into a Greek version called the Septuagint. It was the work done in Egypt, in Alexandria. Because why? The Jews understood Greek better than Hebrew now during this time, during this period of the Hellenization of the world under Alexander the Great. The Roman numeral LXX, 70 being the nearest round number to 72, became the symbol for this version of the Old Testament. Then there was the Seleucid Empire. Syria, Antioch was the capital. The Roman general Pompey made Syria a Roman province in 63 BC that ended Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids had many attempts to gain Palestine and finally came with the defeat of Egypt by Antiochus III in 198. So backing up just a little bit here, among the Jews, two factions developed here during this period of time under the Seleucids. There was the house of Onias. House of Onias was pro-Egyptian, and the house of Tobias. And there's some apocryphal books by those names, okay? Tobias was pro-Assyrian. He was wanted the Seleucids to reign. Antiochus IV, we'll talk about him more. He tried to replace the Jewish high priest Onias III with his brother Jason. Jason was a Hellenizer who wanted to make Jerusalem into a Greek city. So a gymnasium and adjoining racetrack was built right by the temple. Jewish lads exercised in the Greek fashion, that is, in nude. 1 Maccabees 1:14 says, so they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to Gentile custom, removed the marks of circumcision, abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. So that's what's going on during this period. Such Hellenization also included attendance at Greek theaters, the adoption of Greek dress. The Jews who opposed this paganization, this Hellenization of their culture were called Hasidims, the pious people, roughly equivalent to Puritans. Antiochus Epiphanes IV replaced Jason, the high priest, with Menelaus, another Hellenizing Jew. Why? Because he offered to collect more taxes in Palestine. So the Jewish priests were supposed to be descended from Aaron, the elder brother of Moses, but Menelaus may not have even belonged to a priestly family, certainly did not belong to the Aaronic line. So pious Jews resented the selling of their most sacred office of high priest to the highest bidder, especially when money was coming from their own pockets. And this leads us now to the rebellion against this Hellenization, and we'll get into that into the next lecture.